Mark and I were the picture of a happy couple, or so I thought. The late nights at the office started subtly, then became routine. His phone was always glued to his hand, the screen dimming whenever I entered the room. When I finally voiced my concerns, he'd just chuckle and say, "It's just a friend from work. Scarlett, you're overthinking things." But my gut screamed otherwise. So, for his 40th birthday, I planned a surprise party, hoping to gather our friends and celebrate. What I ended up uncovering, however, was a surprise, all right, just not the kind I had in mind. My name is Scarlett, and I'm 42 years old. For the past 15 years, I've been married to Mark. We met in our late 20s, a whirlwind romance that led to a beautiful wedding and a life I genuinely believed was filled with love and happiness. We had our ups and downs, of course, like any long-term couple, but we always managed to navigate them, or so I thought. Looking back, maybe I was just too naive, too willing to see the best in him. Mark worked as a project manager for a tech company downtown. The hours could be demanding, but he always made an effort to be home for dinner, or at least that was the case for the first decade or so. Lately, things had shifted. The late nights started becoming more frequent, often stretching past midnight. When I'd ask about his day, he'd give vague answers about deadlines and important projects. I didn't pry too much. I understood the pressure of work. But then came the phone. It was like an extension of his hand. He'd take it everywhere, even to the bathroom. And the constant texting was unnerving. He'd smile at his screen, a private, knowing smile that I wasn't a part of. If I happened to glance over, the screen would instantly go dark, or he'd quickly switch to a different app. "Work stuff," he'd say with a dismissive wave of his hand if I ever commented. Then there were the hushed phone calls. He'd step out onto the balcony or into the spare bedroom, his voice lowered, almost a whisper. I'd strain to hear, but the words were always muffled, indistinct. When he came back inside, he'd act like nothing was amiss. "Just a colleague," he'd explain, his tone casual, too casual. My intuition, that little voice we all have, started to whisper, then gradually grew louder, almost a shout. Something wasn't right. Mark was changing, and I didn't like the direction he was heading. I tried talking to him about it a few times, expressing my concerns, telling him I felt a distance growing between us. Each time he'd reassure me, pull me close, and tell me I was being silly, that work was just stressing him out. I wanted to believe him desperately. Our life together was everything to me. His 40th birthday was coming up in a few weeks. I decided to plan a surprise party. I thought it would be a perfect way to bring our friends together, celebrate this milestone, and maybe, just maybe, bridge that growing gap between us. I started making arrangements, contacting our closest friends, booking a small venue at a local restaurant, a cozy Italian place we both loved. I even managed to get in touch with some of his old college buddies who had moved out of state. It was going to be a great night. As the day of the party approached, Mark seemed more stressed than usual. He was working even longer hours, and the phone activity had intensified. One evening, about a week before his birthday, he came home particularly late. I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I heard him quietly come into the room, and then I heard the faint sound of his typing on his phone. I opened my eyes slightly and saw the glow of the screen illuminating his face. He was smiling again, that same private smile. The next morning, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I looked at his phone while he was in the shower. Guilt gnawed at me, but the suspicion was too strong to ignore. It was locked, of course. He never used to have a passcode. That was another recent change. My heart sank a little. Later that day, while he was at work, I racked my brain, trying to remember if he had ever mentioned a passcode. Then it hit me. Our anniversary. It was always our anniversary. For everything. I grabbed his phone, my hands trembling slightly, and typed in the date. It unlocked. My breath hitched. The first thing I saw was a string of messages with a contact labeled Sarah from accounting. The messages were intimate, flirty, heart emojis, inside jokes I didn't understand, and plans for lunch dates. My stomach churned. I scrolled further back, and the messages became increasingly personal, revealing a level of closeness that went far beyond a casual work friendship. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This couldn't be happening. Mark? With someone from work? I felt betrayed, hurt, and utterly confused. How could he do this? We had a good life, didn't we? Or was I the only one who thought so? I spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying the messages in my head, trying to make sense of it all. The late nights at the office suddenly took on a whole new meaning. The hushed phone calls, the constant texting, the secret smiles. It all clicked into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. The surprise party was still on for Saturday night. I had put so much effort into it, and canceling it now would raise suspicion. Besides, a part of me, a very small, perhaps foolish part, still hoped there was some innocent explanation, that I had somehow misinterpreted everything. But deep down, I knew the truth. Saturday evening arrived, and I put on a brave face. I greeted our friends as they arrived at the restaurant, trying to act normal, like everything was fine. Mark was running late as usual these days. He's stuck in traffic. I lied to our friends, forcing a smile. Finally, about half an hour after the party was supposed to start, Mark walked in. "Surprise!" everyone yelled. His face registered surprise, but there was also something else there, a flicker of annoyance, maybe even fear. He quickly masked it with a wide smile and thanked everyone for coming. As the night went on, I observed Mark closely. He seemed a little on edge, constantly checking his phone. Then, about an hour into the party, Sarah from accounting walked in. She hadn't been on my original guest list. Mark looked genuinely shocked to see her, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. Sarah, on the other hand, looked perfectly composed, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips as she walked straight towards Mark. "Oh, hey Mark," she said, her voice a little too sweet, a little too familiar. "I heard there was a party." Mark stammered. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "Well, I was in the neighborhood," she replied smoothly, her eyes flicking towards me for a brief, almost challenging moment. "And I thought I'd drop by to wish you a happy birthday." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Our friends exchanged uneasy glances. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. I forced another smile, trying to play it cool. "Sarah, it's so nice of you to come," I said, my voice perhaps a little too bright. "Mark has mentioned you so much." Mark's face paled slightly. Sarah's smile widened. "Oh, really?" she said, turning to him. "What have you been saying about me?" The conversation that followed was stilted and uncomfortable. Mark tried to downplay their connection, while Sarah seemed to relish in the awkwardness of the situation, dropping little hints and innuendos that made my stomach clench. It was becoming painfully obvious to everyone in the room that there was more to their relationship than just a casual work friendship. Then came the moment that shattered the last vestiges of my denial. One of Mark's college buddies, who hadn't seen him in years, pulled him aside to catch up. I saw Sarah subtly slip her phone into Mark's back pocket while he was distracted. A few minutes later, Mark excused himself to go to the restroom. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as Sarah casually walked in the same direction a few moments later. My friends noticed my distress. My best friend, Emily, came over and put a comforting hand on my arm. "Scarlett, are you okay?" she asked softly. I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't think so, I whispered back, my voice trembling. I think something's been going on between Mark and Sarah." Emily's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded understandingly. "What do you want to do?" she asked. In that moment, a wave of clarity washed over me. I was done with the lies, the sneaking around, the constant suspicion. I deserved better. Our marriage deserved better. "I want to know the truth," I said, my voice gaining a newfound resolve. "And I think I know how to get it." I discreetly pulled Emily aside and told her about the messages I had seen on Mark's phone. We devised a plan, a risky one, but I felt like I had nothing left to lose. When Mark finally returned from the restroom, Sarah was already back, chatting animatedly with another group of our friends. Mark acted like nothing had happened, but I saw the relief in his eyes when he realized his phone was back in his pocket. The night continued, but the festive atmosphere had dissipated. Everyone could sense the tension in the air. I played the gracious hostess, making small talk and refilling drinks, all the while waiting for the right moment to execute our plan. Finally, as the party was winding down and most of our friends had left, I made my move. I gathered the few remaining guests, including Emily, around the table. Mark and Sarah looked at me, confused. "Mark," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I have a little surprise for you." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, inconspicuous voice recorder. I thought it would be nice to capture some memories from your special night. Mark's face turned ashen. Sarah's smile faltered. "What's that for?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "Oh, just for fun," I replied innocently. "But you know what? I think it might have captured something interesting earlier." I pressed play. The first few seconds were just background noise, the chatter of the party. Then we heard Mark's voice, clear as day, followed by Sarah's. "Did you tell her I was coming?" Sarah asked. "No, of course not," Mark replied. "I told you, she's just a friend from work. You don't have to worry about her." Sarah laughed, a low, throaty sound. "Oh, I'm not worried about her, Mark. I'm worried about us getting caught." There was a brief pause, and then we heard the unmistakable sound of a kiss. A gasp went through the small group of friends still present. Mark looked like he had been struck by lightning. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. I stopped the recording. The silence in the room was deafening. I looked at Mark, my eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. "So," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "just a friend from work, huh?" Mark didn't say anything. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting between me and Sarah, then back to me. He looked utterly speechless. This was the moment I had been dreading, but also the moment I knew I needed. The truth was out in the open, exposed for everyone to see. And as much as it hurt, a part of me felt a sense of relief. The charade was over. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken accusations and shattered trust. Mark finally found his voice, but it was weak, barely a whisper. "Scarlett, I can explain." "Explain what, Mark?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil raging inside me. "Explain the secret lunches? The late-night texts? The hushed phone calls? Or the kissing?" My gaze flicked to Sarah, who was now staring at the floor, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Maybe you can explain to me when exactly just a friend from work became this intimate?" Mark's eyes pleaded with me. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, but the recording spoke for itself. There was no denying what we had all just heard. Emily stepped forward, her expression a mixture of sympathy and anger. "Mark, we all heard it. There's no way to spin this." One of Mark's old college buddies, Tom, who had flown in from Chicago for the party, looked at him with disappointment. "I came all this way for this? I always thought you and Scarlett had something special." Sarah finally looked up, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Mark and I, we're close friends. That recording." She trailed off, clearly unable to come up with a believable excuse. "Close friends who kiss?" I interjected, my voice sharp. "Is that what you call it?" Mark remained silent, his head bowed in shame. The truth was out, raw and ugly, and he knew he couldn't lie his way out of this one. The remaining guests started to murmur amongst themselves, their faces reflecting shock and disbelief. The festive atmosphere of the surprise party had completely evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. "I think we should all probably go," Emily said quietly, sensing the need to give Mark and me some space. The other guests nodded in agreement, offering me sympathetic glances as they made their excuses and left. Soon, it was just the three of us, Mark, Sarah, and me, standing in the awkward silence of the now empty party venue. The remnants of balloons and streamers mocked the joyous occasion I had so carefully planned. "You should go, Sarah," Mark said softly, not meeting her eyes. Sarah nodded quickly, grabbed her purse, and practically ran out of the restaurant, leaving Mark and me alone. I looked at my husband, the man I had shared my life with for 15 years, and I felt a profound sense of sadness. Sadness for what we had, for what we had lost, and for the person he had become. Mark, I began, my voice trembling slightly, how long has this been going on? He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with guilt and regret. It started a few months ago, he confessed, his voice barely audible. We were working closely on a project, and one thing led to another. A few months, I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. So, all those late nights, the phone calls, the secrecy, it was all for her? He nodded slowly, unable to meet my gaze. And what about me, Mark? I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. Did you ever think about how this would make me feel? Did you ever consider what this would do to our marriage? He finally looked at me, tears welling up in his eyes. Scarlett, I know I messed up. I never meant for this to happen. I still love you. His words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of his betrayal. Love me? I scoffed. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this, Mark. You wouldn't have lied to me, you wouldn't have sneaked around behind my back. The hurt was so deep, so raw. It felt like a physical ache in my chest. All the years we had spent together, the memories we had made, suddenly felt tainted, overshadowed by his deception. I don't understand, I said, shaking my head in disbelief. We had a good life. What did you need that you couldn't find with me? He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. I don't know, Scarlett. It just happened. Sarah made me feel appreciated, I guess. Seen. His words stung. Had I not made him feel appreciated? Had I not seen him? I had dedicated my life to him, to our home, to our happiness. And this was how he repaid me? So what now, Mark? I asked, my voice cold. Where do we go from here? He looked at me, his eyes filled with desperation. I want to fix this, Scarlett. I want to save our marriage. I'll do anything. But the trust was broken, shattered into a million pieces. I didn't know if I could ever put it back together again. The image I had of Mark, the man I thought I knew, had been replaced by a stranger, a liar who had betrayed my love and trust. I need some time, Mark, I said, my voice weary. I need some space to think. He nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. I'll stay at a hotel tonight, he said. I'll give you all the time you need. He gathered his coat and keys, his movements heavy and defeated. As he walked out of the restaurant, I watched him go, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, sadness, confusion, and a flicker of something else, something that felt like freedom. I stayed at the restaurant for a while longer, gathering my thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened. Emily came back to check on me, her face full of concern. Oh, Scarlett, she said, pulling me into a hug. I'm so sorry. Me too, I whispered, tears finally starting to fall. Me too. Emily helped me pack up the remaining party decorations. As we walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, I felt a sense of finality. The surprise party had indeed been a surprise, but not in the way I had intended. It had exposed a truth that had been hidden in the shadows, and it had irrevocably changed the course of my life. The next few weeks were a blur. Mark stayed at a hotel, calling me every day, begging for forgiveness, promising to change. I listened to him, but my heart remained heavy. The betrayal had cut deep, and I didn't know if the wound would ever fully heal. I talked to Emily a lot, and she was a constant source of support. I also considered talking to a therapist, someone who could help me navigate these difficult emotions. One evening, Mark came over to the house. He looked tired and worn out. He had brought flowers and a heartfelt letter, pouring out his apologies and his love for me. I let him in and we sat down in the living room. He read the letter to me, his voice thick with emotion. When he finished, he looked at me, his eyes filled with hope. Scarlett, he said, I know I messed up badly, but I promise you, it will never happen again. I love you more than anything in the world. Please, give me another chance. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the pain in his eyes. I knew he was sorry, truly sorry. But the question was, could I forgive him? Could I move past this betrayal and rebuild our marriage? I thought about the past 15 years, the good times we had shared, the life we had built together. It wasn't all bad. There had been love, laughter, and happiness. But now there was also this deep wound of betrayal. After a long silence, I finally spoke. "Mark," I said softly, "I do love you, but what you did, it hurt me deeply. I don't know if I can just forget about it and move on." He nodded understandingly. "I know," he said. "I don't expect you to, but please let me try. Let me show you that I can be the husband you deserve." I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Okay, Mark," I said. "You can try, but it's going to take time. And trust will have to be earned back." He reached for my hand, his grip tight. "Thank you, Scarlett," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I promise, I won't let you down again." And so, we began the long and arduous journey of rebuilding our marriage. It wasn't easy. There were many tears, many difficult conversations, and many moments of doubt. But we both were willing to work at it, to fight for what we had. Mark ended his inappropriate relationship with Sarah. He became more open and communicative. He started coming home earlier from work, and his phone was no longer a constant barrier between us. He made a conscious effort to show me that he loved me and valued our relationship. Slowly, gradually, the trust started to return. The hurt didn't disappear completely, but it began to fade, replaced by a fragile hope. We started going on dates again, rediscovering the spark that had first brought us together. We talked more, really talked, about our feelings, our fears, and our dreams for the future. It wasn't the same as before. There was a scar, a reminder of the pain we had gone through. But perhaps, in a way, it made us stronger. We had faced a crisis and had chosen to fight for our marriage, to build something new on the foundation of what we had. Looking back, the surprise party was a turning point. It was painful, humiliating, and heartbreaking. But it also forced us to confront the truth and ultimately gave us a chance to rebuild our relationship, stronger and more honest than before. It wasn't the 40th birthday celebration I had envisioned, but it was the catalyst for a new chapter in our lives, one that I hoped would be filled with genuine love and lasting happiness.